Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to the debate about the prospective College of Charleston and MUSC merger. Just kidding. I know where I am. So, what makes more sense? Religion, or atheism, or basketball? I suspect we're missing a few people because of basketball. That's probably their answer. I'm Adam Parker. I'm the arts and culture writer for the Post and Courier. I used to be the religion and culture writer in charge of the Faith and Values section until about 2 years ago, and did that for a number of years. I've got a couple of questions for you before we really get started. Who in this room believes that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God? Raise your hand. Meaning, it says what it says, it means what it means, and that's it. Yeah, okay. Who in the room believes the Bible is meant to be interpreted and religion must adapt in order to remain relevant? Okay, number of people, a few people. Yeah. And who in the room does not believe in anything supernatural, including God? Okay. So, I guess we're evenly matched, more or less, tonight. That's good. That's good. That's great. Okay, so let me explain how this will work, and then we'll get to it. There will be 20 minutes, a 20-minute opening statement from each of our debaters. So we'll sit there and respectfully listen, and everybody, of course, will be respectful. And then there'll be a conversation between the two debaters and me. That's why there are 3 chairs there. We're going to sit there and talk and chat and whatever, and hopefully that won't bore you. And if it does, be polite, please. And then we're going to go into a Q&A session, and that'll run about 20 minutes. The idea is to try to keep this to approximately 2 hours, right? Because otherwise... And of course, I expect everybody to behave very well. If any atheist misbehaves, I'm going to throw my Bible at you. And if any believer misbehaves, I'm going to throw my Sam Harris at you. Hard. Okay. Hopefully the conversation will stimulate some thoughtful questions and illuminate the way everybody thinks about these things. Our 2 debaters. And I'm not quite sure there's a right and a wrong, but we'll see about that as we go. So, without further ado, who's going first?
Silverman's going first. You want to mention the gathering at Juanita Greenberg's?
Oh, there's a gathering at Juanita Greenberg's immediately following, where everybody can get drunk and curse at each other and throw Bibles around, whatever you want to do. Okay, so without further ado, Herb Silverman, 20 minutes.
Thank you all for being here, and thanks to our sponsors and Adam Parker, and special thanks to Dr. Marshall for having the good idea to arrange this event. Too often, we listen only to those who believe as we do, and this academic setting is a great place for all of us to go outside of our comfort zone. In my case for why atheism makes more sense than Christianity, I'll begin by telling you what an atheist is, and then describe what I think Christianity is. If Dr. Marshall thinks that I'm mischaracterizing Christianity, I'm sure he'll let me know. An atheist is simply someone without a belief in any gods. I can't prove there are no gods, I just don't have any evidence for it. That's also why I don't believe in astrology or in alien abduction by UFOs. Though I don't believe in any gods, I do believe in many things. As a secular humanist, I believe that ethical values are derived from human needs and interests and are tested and refined by experience. Our deeds are more important than our creeds, and dogmas should never override our compassion for others. We don't have to believe in a certain type of God or in any God in order to be kind and loving to our fellow human beings. Now, I understand why fear of death can lead to a longing for an afterlife where we can be reunited forever with our loved ones in eternal bliss, or where we can come back reincarnated as a better person. I know that many people have felt the presence of Jesus in their lives, but many others have felt the presence of Allah, Vishnu, Shiva, and numerous other gods that neither Dr. Marshall nor I believe in. Religious beliefs can be quite comforting, but it's important to distinguish between wishful thinking and reality. Throughout history, many mysteries in nature, like thunder, earthquakes, and floods, have been attributed to acts of gods. But countless scientific discoveries have changed God beliefs. Next month in Charleston, on April 14th, we will be able to view a total lunar eclipse. Not because of God's wrath, but because the earth will be between the sun and the moon. However, there will always be a so-called God of the gaps, because there will always be mysteries. Yet with every natural scientific discovery, there's less reason to believe in the supernatural. The 18th century French mathematician and astronomer Laplace did groundbreaking work on the stability of our solar system. When Emperor Napoleon asked him why he didn't mention a creator, Laplace said, "I had no need of that hypothesis." Perhaps a future Laplace will explain to a future Napoleon why our universe has no need of a God hypothesis. We know how to distinguish good scientific ideas from bad ones. Scientists start out not knowing an answer and go wherever the evidence leads. Science relies on experimentation, testing, and questioning assumptions critically until a consensus is reached. That's why scientific truths are the same in Pakistan, the United States, Israel, India, countries with very different religious beliefs. But how can we distinguish good religious beliefs from bad ones? Do we choose our God beliefs after researching all religions and selecting the one with the most sensible faith? I think not. So how do we decide? As it turns out, there's a remarkable coincidence. The overwhelming majority choose the religion of their parents. I learned to believe in the biblical God, Yahweh, not Jesus. Why? Because I was born into a Jewish family. Had I been born into a Christian family, I would likely have believed that Jesus is Lord. Most Asians are Buddhists. People from India are generally Hindus. Saudi Arabians are Muslims, and here in the United States, mainly Christians. Religious belief is clearly based more on geography than on theology. Now, with all the conflicting faith beliefs in the world, they cannot all be right, but they can all be wrong. If God's mission was to have religious believers fight endlessly over specific meanings in their ambiguous and contradictory holy books, then God can certainly say, mission accomplished. I cannot generalize about Christianity because there are about 41,000 denominations worldwide, with over 1,000 in the United States alone. However, here's what I think are the central beliefs. Christianity promises salvation by faith through grace, which is why Jesus died on the cross for your sins and rose from the grave. He appeared to some of his followers for a brief time before ascending to heaven, and those who believe this resurrection story go to heaven, those who don't go to hell. Albert Mahler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who Time magazine called the reigning intellectual of the evangelical movement in the United States, says that the Adam and Eve story goes to the heart of Christianity, that the whole point of the crucifixion and resurrection was to undo Adam's original sin. And without Adam, the work of Christ makes no sense. Scientist Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Claims about God, and certainly claims about the resurrection, are extraordinary. But I have yet to hear good evidence. Let me sum up what I think is the evidence for the resurrection. The Bible. That's it. There was nothing written about the resurrection of Jesus other than what is in the Christian Bible. Nothing from the many Roman historians of that time who carefully chronicled major events. Furthermore, the Gospels were written some 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death by supporters who had never even met Jesus. Their principal purpose was to glorify him. Other stories about resurrected gods were popular at the time of Jesus, and the gospel writers wanted to associate Jesus with divine events. Early church fathers, such as Justin Martyr, acknowledged that basic Christian doctrines, like God's having virgin births, performing miracles, crucified, raised from the dead, ascending to heaven, were also in earlier Greco-Roman religions. The best explanation these church leaders could offer was that such stories came from demons and were false, while the same stories in Christianity were true. The belief that Satan placed these earlier stories in other cultures and religions to confound later Christians became known as diabolical mimicry. And Jesus wasn't the only New Testament figure to rise from the dead around that time. In fact, he wasn't even the first Jew. According to Matthew 27, at the moment Jesus died, there was an earthquake and graves opened, and lots of Jews were resurrected and went to Jerusalem, where they were seen by many. Again, there are no sources outside the Bible for this extraordinary claim. Wouldn't we have expected to hear something from the resurrected and their families, like what it's like to be dead, how long they stayed in Jerusalem, and whether they returned to their graves? A more likely explanation is that early Christians simply invented these resurrection stories to conform to previous religious beliefs, which made it easier to promote Christianity. Even within the New Testament, there are contradictory claims about the resurrection. They differ on important details, like who first saw an empty tomb, who first saw Jesus after the resurrection, where he appeared, how many appearances he made, and how many saw him. And why did Jesus appear only to his small band of insiders, Wouldn't a merciful God provide resurrection evidence to outsiders, especially if such belief is necessary for salvation? Without evidence, I think it makes more sense to think that such a God does not exist. Then again, perhaps evidence just wasn't that important, because the gospel writers expected the world to end very soon, proclaiming the good news that that generation would not pass away before Jesus returned. Well, that did not happen. Succeeding generations also anticipated an imminent return in rapture. It's been 2,000 years, and something apparently went wrong. Christians began to realize that their stories did not sound very credible, which is why they actively discouraged reason and doubt. For instance, John's Gospel, the last written, came more than 60 years after Jesus died, and previous generations had passed away. Perhaps that's why John said, "Blessed are those who have not seen, yet still believe," which might be why skepticism and critical thinking have been aggressively discouraged through much of Christian history. Here's what 3rd century Christian apologist Tertullian said: "The Son of God died. Just because it is absurd, it is to be believed. And he was buried and rose again. It is certain because it is impossible." If that makes any sense to you, please explain later. Martin Luther said, "Whoever wants to be a Christian should tear the eyes out of his reason." And blind faith is a requirement in Romans 14. He who doubts is damned. Why is it so horrible to doubt? Because if people approach religion with the same kind of doubt and skepticism as scientists do in their work, there would probably be few believers. Most Christians are skeptical about other religions, even skeptical about different kinds of Christians. For instance, how many believe this next resurrection story? After Jesus died, but before he went to heaven, Jesus stopped in the United States, in Missouri. How do we know? Because this information was chiseled on gold plates in Egyptian hieroglyphics and buried in Palmyra, New York. In 1827, the angel Moroni led Joseph Smith to the gold plates in a magic stone. When Smith put the magic stone into his hat and buried his face in the hat, he was able to translate the plates into English. When Jesus returns, he will again go to Missouri. How do we know all this? Because it's in the Book of Mormon, one of the fastest growing Christian religions. Christians who are skeptical of this resurrection story should understand why I'm skeptical of theirs. Last month, some of you might have seen the debate between Bill Nye, the science guy, and Ken Ham, founder of the Creationist Museum. In the debate about whether creationism was a viable model for our origins, the most revealing moment for me came when they were both asked, "What would make you change your mind?" Ken Ham said, "Nothing." And Bill Nye said, "Evidence." Well, not all Christians believe as Ken Ham does. A recent Gallup poll showed that approximately half of all Christians in the United States believe that the earth is less than 10,000 years old. Just as modern Christians accept the evidence that the earth revolves around the sun, many Christians are now even willing to accept the overwhelming scientific evidence that the earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Christian apologists today realize that they cannot actively discourage reason or science, yet they usually start with an answer and then work backwards to try and justify it. True believers, whether in astrology, tarot cards, or religion, look for and notice only information that confirms their beliefs, while overlooking or downplaying contradictory evidence. This is known as confirmation bias. Aware of such dangers, Charles Darwin said, "I have steadily endeavored to keep my mind free so as to give up any hypothesis, however beloved, as soon as facts are shown to be opposed to it." When scientists come up with a promising theory, they routinely look for evidence that might prove it wrong. You just don't see many religious leaders who are open to falsifying their beliefs. But some religions do make more sense to me than others. I prefer those that place behavior above belief and focus on improving the human condition, and not those that place belief above behavior and view this life as preparation for an afterlife. Not surprisingly, my preferred religions are the ones closest to the secular humanist principles of striving to be good without any gods. Our laws in this secular country deal with what we do, not with what we believe, and I wish religions would do likewise. Again, as an atheist, I don't believe in any gods, but I can't prove that none exist. I was recently asked this interesting question: what kind of God belief would make the most sense to you? After thinking about it, here's my answer. If scientists ever create a primitive life form that evolves into something with intelligence, maybe that something would believe its creator to be a god. So perhaps some super scientist or committee of scientists created our universe, then let nature take its course and moved on to create bigger and better things in some multiverse, just as human scientists would attempt to create more complex life forms. But scientists die, and so it would be with my hypothetical creator of our universe. Of course, there's still the sticky question about my creator's creator. Do I believe this anthropomorphic scenario? No. But it makes more sense to me than the Christian belief that Jesus is God manifest on earth to redeem us for a sin that someone in the distant past committed. God then sacrifices himself to save us from himself. And we will be rewarded or punished for eternity based on whether or not we believe this unbelievable story. Frankly, that reminds me of a quote from Mark Twain: "Faith is believing what you know ain't so." To conclude, here's what makes the most sense to me as an atheist and a secular humanist. We are all part of a natural world, the result of unguided evolutionary change. I don't think we should give credit to a deity for our accomplishments or blame satanic forces when we behave badly. We should take personal responsibility for our actions. I try to live my life to its fullest in the only life I have, and hope to make a positive difference because it's the right thing to do, not because of an imagined afterlife. My afterlife will be any good works and contributions that I leave behind. Thank you.
Very respectful applause. Thank you very much. That was Dr. Herb Silverman, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at the College of Charleston, founder of the Secular Coalition for America and founder of the Secular Humanists of the Lowcountry. His latest book, Candidate Without a Prayer, an autobiography of a Jewish atheist in the Bible Belt, is available for purchase out on the table outside after the event. Next up is Dr. Wallace Marshall. Wallace is director of the Charleston chapter of Reasonable Faith, a Christian apologetics organization with 40 chapters throughout the U.S. and 7 international chapters. He received his MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary and his PhD from Boston College, where he studied the historical interaction between science, religion, and philosophy in the West. Please welcome Dr. Wallace Marshall.
Well, thank you, Dr. Silverman. I can see we're going to have a vigorous discussion this evening. The question before us tonight is Christianity or atheism, which makes more sense? And I think there are 2 aspects to this question. One is whether Christianity or atheism is more reasonable given the hard evidence that we possess, philosophical, scientific, historical. And the other, I think, is whether Christianity or atheism makes more sense of the broad spectrum of human experience, intellectual, moral, and existential. Given the breadth of the question, I'm going to be broad rather than long in the points that I make this evening, and then I look forward to getting into the details with Dr. Silverman and Adam Parker, and in the Q&A with you that is to follow. Some of the arguments I'll be making are generic to theism, since Christianity is a form of theism, and others will be specifically about Christian theism. But before I begin with those, let me address some of the points that Dr. Silverman made in his opening statement. You'll notice that you didn't hear any arguments in favor of atheism being true. Rather, what you heard was a popular redefinition of atheism. So atheism no longer means the belief that God doesn't exist, but atheism is just a psychological description of being without a belief in God. Now, I don't care to quibble about terms, but that's simply redefining atheism as agnosticism. If you don't have any evidence that God exists, that doesn't give you a right to conclude that he doesn't exist. Somebody might come to you and say, a stockbroker might come to you and say, give me your money, I've got a great fund that I'm going to invest in, I think the stock market's going to go up this way starting next week, and you may hear all of his reasons and decide, no, you're not compelled by his evidence, but you don't conclude on the basis of that the stock market is going to go down. You're just agnostic as to whether it's going to go up or down. So even if you don't think there's any good evidence for the existence of God, that doesn't give you any intellectual right logically to go to God's non-existence. That should simply leave you with agnosticism. Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. Now, as to Dr. Silverman's arguments against Christianity, I think I discern 2 of them. One is the idea that Christianity has bad historical fruits, that it has been contrary to the progress of science, and that it has in general hindered the advance of knowledge, intellectual inquiry, and encouraged blind faith. With regard to the relationship between Christianity and science, I could not disagree more strongly. This view that Dr. Silverman has advanced has been universally discredited by historians of science for decades. It's very common in popular culture today, but no reputable historian of science is going to put it forward. In fact, historians of science even have a name for this, so universally has it been discredited. It's called the warfare hypothesis. And as I say, the demise of this paradigm is one of the first lessons you learn in any reputable program in the history of science. In fact, one of the problems that historians of science wrestle with is why modern science arose only in the Christian West. That's a very interesting question, and I think there's a strong relationship between the history of Christianity and the rise of modern science. As for the idea that Christianity has somehow been against intellectual inquiry, this statement could only come from someone who is ignorant of the writings of Christian theologians throughout history. Of course, Dr. Silverman can cherry pick a couple of quotations from Tertullian and Luther, but even if you read the writings of Tertullian and Luther, you can see that both of them were immensely trained in philosophy. If anybody was not in favor of blind faith, it was Martin Luther. We all know how he railed against the Roman Catholic Church. But seriously, folks, where was the modern university invented? This very institution that we sit in the Middle Ages. Where was the idea of these debates invented? In the Middle Ages. Intellectual inquiry has been a hallmark of Christian thought ever since its inception. And I would just invite you to go to a library and pick the 38 volumes of the Church Fathers off the shelf and just open it up to any random page and read it. And you're certainly not going to get anti-intellectualism. And Dr. Silverman's other argument against Christianity is that there's no good evidence for Jesus' resurrection, and that all the evidence that is there is from the Bible itself. Well, first of all, you don't treat the Bible, if you're a historian and approaching the argument for Jesus' resurrection, just as a single book. The Bible at first was a collection of many different books, and so you can't look at it that way. You have to look at each of the individual components of the New Testament in an isolated way. You have to also consider the writings of St. Paul, the letters that went into the New Testament. Now, obviously, we're not here to debate the resurrection tonight, though I am interested in doing that if Dr. Silverman or anyone else wants to take me on. I'll just say this, that no matter how skeptical an approach you take to the New Testament, there are three facts which are agreed upon by the overwhelming majority of ancient historians and New Testament scholars who have studied in this field. And those are the discovery of the empty tomb, the experiences that multiple people had of seeing Jesus alive after the discovery of the empty tomb, and the origin of the Christian faith. Now, Dr. Silverman has given us a story of the origin of Christianity that comes right out of the Zeitgeist movie, but no serious scholar embraces this. And I'll just quote to you from Bart Ehrman, who, as you know, is no Christian and isn't even a theist, but he is a serious scholar in this field. And listen to what he says here. The claim that Jesus was simply made up falters on every ground. The alleged parallels between Jesus and the pagan savior gods in most instances reside in modern imagination. We do not have accounts of others who were born to virgin mothers and who died as an atonement for sin and then were raised from the dead, despite what the sensationalists claim ad nauseum in their propagandized versions. Aspects of the Jesus story simply would not have been invented by anyone wanting to make up a new savior. The earliest followers of Jesus declared that he was a crucified Messiah. But prior to Christianity, there were no Jews at all, of any kind whatsoever, who thought that there would be a future crucified Messiah. The Messiah was to be a figure of grandeur and power who overthrew the enemy. Anyone who wanted to make up a Messiah would make him like that. Why did the Christians not do so? Because they believed specifically that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, if someone wants to debate me on the resurrection, my contention would be that if you take those three basic facts that I mentioned a few moments ago, there is no plausible naturalistic explanation of those facts. In fact, among scholars today, there isn't any naturalistic explanation that has any kind of widespread acceptance. And my second contention would be that Jesus' resurrection is the best explanation of those facts. But to act as if there's no evidence for the resurrection and it's just blind faith based on statements in a single book is absurd. So I must hasten on, however, to the positive case that I wish to build. Let me return to those two questions that I mentioned. And I want to begin by talking about the hard evidence. First of all, from the origin of the universe. We now have compelling scientific evidence that the universe is not eternal, but came into being, matter, space, time, and energy, at a definite point in the finite past known as the Big Bang. Although there are some cosmological models that posit a multiverse or a succession of Big Bangs, none of these models can be extended to past infinity. And if you're interested in reading a brief survey of the scientific evidence for this, you can pick up an article on our book table on your way out. As the eminent cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin stated at Stephen Hawking's 70th birthday party, all of the evidence we have says the universe had a beginning. Even Lawrence Krauss, an atheist physicist who has gone through all kinds of contortions to try to avoid this conclusion, was recently compelled to concede, I agree, all the evidence says the universe had a beginning. Even apart from the scientific evidence, there are two compelling philosophical reasons to believe that the universe doesn't have an infinite past. First of all, you run into all kinds of contradictions if you try to suppose an infinite number of things actually existed. As Dr. Silverman himself recounts of his early mathematical education, the most important lesson I learned was that the number infinity does not exist in reality. But that implies that the number of past events in the history of the universe cannot be infinite. The second philosophical reason to believe that the universe has a finite past is the impossibility of forming an infinite series by adding one member after another. Let me explain what I mean. If you were immortal and you were to begin counting to infinity right now, it's easy to see that you could never get there because there'd always be one more number you could count. Well, the same logic applies to counting down in reverse from negative infinity. If you had been counting down from negative infinity, it would never be now, because whenever you would get to zero, you could always say, well, why didn't you get there 2 weeks ago, or 200 years ago, or 20,000 years ago? In fact, at any point along the whole countdown, you would have already been counting for an infinite amount of time, so that it could never be now, which is absurd because obviously it is now, at this very moment. So, for those two philosophical reasons and for the scientific evidence, we know that the cosmos is not eternal, but came into being at a definite point in the finite past. And there are only two options as to how this happened. Either the universe sprang into existence like sheer magic without any cause whatsoever, or it was brought into being by an entity that in the very nature of the case must be a transcendent cause that is immaterial, spaceless, timeless, and immensely powerful. Now, I think it's very easy to judge which of those options is more reasonable, and I would also point out that the scientific and philosophical evidence here marvelously confirm a 2,000-year-old core doctrine of Christianity, namely creatio ex nihilo, that the universe was created out of nothing. Hard evidence number two, the fine-tuning of the universe. Fine-tuning is an amazing phenomenon cosmologists have studied over the last 4 decades. The laws of nature, when you express them mathematically, contain these various constants that have to be tuned to an incredible degree of precision in order for life of any kind to exist. Not only biological life, but even the formation of galaxies and chemical elements that provide the basis for life to emerge would have been impossible if these constants were altered by any more than a hair's breadth. I'll just give you one example. The Oxford physicist Roger Penrose has calculated this thing called the low entropy condition. And he shows that in order for the universe to be life-permitting, this has to fall within 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. Now, Dr. Silverman, as a mathematician, may be the only person in here who can appreciate just how enormous a number that is. But for those of you who aren't mathematicians, listen to this illustration that the German cosmologist Rüdiger Voss gives in a book that was published just recently. This double exponent, he writes, is unimaginably huge. It has so many zeros that it would, if printed in the format of this book, amount to a stack that were considerably higher than the diameter of our observable universe. The late NASA astronomer Robert Jasper, who had been an atheist all his life, was compelled to concede that fine-tuning was, quote, the most powerful evidence for the existence of God ever to come out of science. In fact, the evidence for fine-tuning combined with the evidence for an absolute beginning that I spoke of just previously threw Jasper into a terrible quandary. He said, I've been trained to think like an atheist all my life. I don't even know how to think in terms of God's existing, and yet I can't deny this evidence. Let me turn finally to the biological history of our planet, typically the last stronghold of atheists. But even here, the ground is crumbling under their feet. Whatever difficulties you may think the biological history of our planet poses to certain interpretations of the early chapters of Genesis, ever since Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA in the 1950s, it has become increasingly clear that it poses far more severe difficulties to the Darwinistic view of evolution, according to which all development has been driven by the slow, gradual accumulation of random genetic mutations. Scientists have discovered that information a coded language with specific instructions for building highly complex machines lies at the very basis, the very bottom of biological life. For every one functional amino acid sequence, there is an astronomical number. The estimates range from 10 to the 63rd power to 10 to the 77th power of non-functional sequences. That is, sequences that wouldn't confer any benefit on the host organism and in most cases would be detrimental. And the entire number of organisms estimated to have lived in the entire history of the planet is only 10 to the 40th power, which despite being a huge number, is only 1/10 trillionth of that 10 to the 77th number. The upshot is that even given the comparatively vast scale of biological history, there isn't anywhere near enough time for an undirected evolutionary process to have brought about the history of life on this planet. And lest you should think that this is creationist banter, listen to what Leslie Valiant, a scientist at Harvard, writes in a book published just last summer. Quote, "If all the mutations that drive evolution were simply random," and that's the core of Darwinism, "it would proceed at an impossibly slow and inefficient pace." Reviewing Valiant's book in the New York Times recently, Edward Frenkel, a professor of mathematics at Cal Berkeley, concludes, "This is science at its best, driven not by dogma and blind belief, but by the desire to understand, intellectual integrity, and reliance on fact." Notice whose dogma and blind belief he's talking about there. Not that of religious people, but that of the Darwinistic fundamentalists, as we like to call them. Let me turn now to that second question, that broader question, whether Christianity or atheism makes more sense of the broad spectrum of human experience. First of all, let's consider our moral experience, which involves three basic things. First of all, an apprehension of objective moral values. Secondly, an obligation to conform our behavior to those values. And thirdly, the legitimacy of praise and blame and of moral indignation. Atheism provides no grounding for any of these things, because if atheism is true, human morality, as Dr. Silverman has said in other speeches, is merely the biological and sociological spin-off of our evolutionary history. The ultimate ground of all being, in that case, is simply matter and energy, which are mindless and thus morally indifferent. As one of Dr. Silverman's heroes, Richard Dawkins, bluntly puts it in his book, A Darwinian View of Life, quote, "There is, at bottom, no evil and no good." Alex Rosenberg, an atheist philosopher of science at Duke University, is equally frank in his recent book, An Atheist Guide to Reality, Enjoying Life Without Illusions. "There is no such thing as morally right or wrong," he says. "Individual human life is meaningless and without ultimate moral value. We need to face the fact that nihilism is true." Theism, on the other hand, provides a solid foundation for all three of those aspects of morality that I mentioned, because in that case, our moral values and duties would correspond to and be firmly rooted in the transcendent anchor and ground of all existence, namely God himself. Not only is objective morality in general impossible to ground on atheism, but an atheistic Darwinian view of existence is specifically at odds with some of our most cherished moral values in the West: the intrinsic dignity and value of every human life, equality before the law, caring for the poor and oppressed, protecting the weak, and so on. Insofar as modern atheistic Darwinists cherish these values, it's simply parasitic on Christian civilization. Christianity, on the other hand, firmly grounds these values in its doctrine that every human being is created in the image of God and has an immortal soul, and in the Bible's repeated injunctions throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament to care for the weak and the poor. Indeed, it's no accident that the high emphasis on these values arose historically only in the Christian West. Same thing with modern science. People ought to spread out a map of the world more frequently and put pins in places and ask why those pins are just in those specific spots on the map. So many interesting questions could be raised if we did that. Number three, Christianity not only makes the most sense of good and evil in general, it also makes the most sense of moral extremes, that is, of human greatness and human depravity. As Pascal writes in the Pensées, man's greatness and wretchedness are so evident that the true religion must necessarily teach us that there is in man some great principle of greatness and some great principle of wretchedness. It must also account for such amazing contradictions. Christian anthropology provides just such an account in its twin doctrines of the Imago Dei, that man is created in the image of God, and of the fall. In fact, I submit that there is no religion or philosophy on this planet that has such an exalted view of mankind or that takes human evil as seriously as Christianity does. Christianity makes far more sense of free will than atheism does. It's difficult to provide any meaningful account of free will on atheism because if material substance is all that exists, that means your mind is nothing more than a network of neurons and synapses governed by the same inextricable necessity that the atheist holds the rest of the physical world to be governed by. But according to Christianity, the ultimate ground of all being is an immaterial, rational, free mind, namely God's. And because human beings are created in God's image and endowed with an immaterial soul, they have a basis for genuine freedom other than sheer physical determinism, which atheism cannot escape from. Finally, theism makes more sense of our experience of beauty and art than atheism does. At its deepest level, the experience of beauty is an experience of the transcendent, some ultimate goodness above and beyond the concrete representation into which you enter. And the task of the artist is to call our attention to this beauty. Even where the artist invokes tragedy or despair, he is indirectly calling our attention to a lost or unattainable beauty. But atheism has no room for the transcendent. On atheism, beauty and ugliness are simply an accidental byproduct of our evolutionary conditioning and are thus entirely subjective. Your experience of beauty is nothing more than neurons firing in your brain in a particular arrangement. And this is why, by the way, I think an atheistic culture in the long run will be unable to produce great art. The mental universe of atheism is simply small, barren, and literally mundane. And I will close by rattling off a list of 10 deepest longings of human beings that Christianity satisfies. I don't offer this as an argument against atheism, because if atheism is true, the fact that we have these longings would just be a tragic element of our existence, or a cruel joke to the person who feels them intensely. But it is a vital part of the case for Christianity, because if God does exist and has revealed himself as Christianity claims, we should expect that revelation to answer these longings. And they are as follows. Number one, identity. Number two, belonging. To be understood fully and still loved. For love to be real. Immortality, and specifically, I would argue, embodied immortality. Intelligibility and mystery, a world that can be understood and yet that can never be exhausted. Forgiveness, both for our own evils and the liberty and capacity to forgive others for theirs. Justice, redemption, and last but by no means least, meaning, both for ourselves personally and for the cosmos as a whole. The meaning that atheism offers you is simply the subjective sense of something being meaningful to you, but no real, ultimate, transcendent meaning. Christianity, on the other hand, offers what I think is the most noble meaning that has ever been conceived for the human race, to glorify God and to enjoy him forever, in the immortal words of the Westminster Catechism. So that's my case for Christianity. Be happy to open those up, and we'll look forward to getting into the discussion now with Dr. Silverman and with the rest of you, especially those hardy souls that are going to join us at Juanita Greenberg's afterwards. In my circle, we refer to that as phase 2, and then after midnight, phase 3 starts for people that are really interested in these things. So we'll see how tough you are. Thank you.
Drinking alcohol in your quest for meaning. Okay, so we're going to proceed with this conversation. Stay tuned, enjoy. we'll try not to go too long and bore you too much, and then open the floor to some questions. I'll probably start with a couple of my own. There we go. Oh, really? Mine's on. So I'd like to just note a couple of things in response, and then you guys can go at it. All those longings, identity, belonging, love, understanding, immortality, intelligibility, forgiveness, justice, redemption, meaning, I agree they're universal. I agree that religion can certainly provide answers to those things, but I don't know that religion is required necessarily. Just a thought. I'm sure Herb will have something to say about that.
Well, sure, I'd be happy to speak to that. Can you hear me? You better now? Okay, there. So my argument was not that these longings can receive no satisfaction whatsoever outside of religion, but simply that, although that is true for some of them, obviously our longing, for example, for immortality, much less embodied immortality, can't be satisfied if God does not exist or if there is
I can say
no
so.
afterlife.
Yes, you can. I got an answer for that.
Okay.
So, I was on BuzzFeed earlier today, and they had this list of like incredible facts that you can't believe are facts, but are. And one of them is that the water you drink, there's 100% chance that it passed through the digestive system of a dinosaur at one point or another. I thought that was kind of cool. And I guess my point is that in the physical world, nothing is ever destroyed, right? I mean, we're all the molecules, I mean, it is what it is. So it's transformed, but it's not destroyed. So in a way, when we die and return to the earth and decompose, we become, the molecules that make us physically become part of other things, become part of trees, the roots, we get eaten by animals, so we become part of it, and so on and so forth. So, like, in a way, there is this kind of immortality.
Well, I suppose I think that's an unsatisfactory understanding of what it means to have an individual identity. But of course, if material substance is immortal, then in that sense, everything is immortal, and you're still that dinosaur.
I do sometimes feel like one. So Herb, did you want to talk about, these longings?
And that was partly my point, that we do have longings, but just because we have longings for an afterlife and immortality doesn't make it true. And in fact, when I think you mischaracterized my view of infinity, but it seems like you say it doesn't exist. On the other hand, immortality to me sounds like you do think infinity exists. And I think it's finite humans hoping for some kind of infinite being or infinite life after death. And that's a yearning that you and a lot of others have. I wouldn't mind if I had that too, but I also yearn for truth. And I look at evidence, and I see no evidence for this immortal life that you have a yearning for.
Well, bear in mind, my argument was not that the fact that we have these yearnings means that they have to be satisfied. It was an argument for Christianity. So suppose you think that God does exist, and you're evaluating different books, say, divine books that claim to be his revelation. Well, one of the criteria you would use for that is, does it answer the dilemmas, the longings of human existence? So it's in that context that I put these things forward. Obviously, the mere fact that we desire something to be true doesn't make it true. But I did want to correct something, because you said in your opening talk that Christianity is sort of a religion, it revolves around wishful thinking. And I just want to point out that that sort of cuts both ways. The atheist also wishes for certain things. It's not like religion is just comfortable. Religion is very uncomfortable. God is an uncomfortable entity to many, many people. Maybe you've read what the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist, says in his book, The Last Word. He says, I'm deeply troubled by the fact that many of my friends who are intelligent are religious believers. And he says, I'm not, of course, he says, but I have this fear of religion. And he explains what he means by that. And he says, it's not just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my opinion. It's that I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And most atheists I ever talk to are not people who say, I wish God existed, but I just don't see the evidence. There are people who don't like the idea of God. There are people to whom it would be very hard to admit that God exists. So wishful thinking cuts both ways, not just against religion.
Well, I'm not that kind of a wishful thinker. I'm more interested in evidence. And when you say God, you act as if there's only one God that might exist. There are beliefs in over 7,000 different gods. And I've always said, if I have evidence of a God, then I'll change my mind.
Well, I gave you some evidence in the cosmological argument tonight, and let me just go to your objection to that against an actual infinite. The fact that human beings will go on living forever is not an actual infinite. As I said, you could be immortal and begin counting right now, and you'd never get to infinity. So no matter, even if the doctrine of the resurrection according to Christianity is true, no matter how many eons into the future of the world to come we live, you'll never have lived an infinite number of years because each of us had a beginning. So you don't have any kind of problems with things going on and on and on. That's just everlasting duration. But that's not an actual infinite, which is where the problems come in. But if the number of events in the past history of the universe is infinite, then you do have that problem.
Are you saying then that God is not infinite, that he came into being at some point? Maybe he was created by a different creator? Because you're going to have the same kind of infinite regress if you believe in God as you do in the universe. And if God always was, so can the universe or the multiverse be. In fact, you even quoted Penrose, and Penrose has what he views as good scientific evidence for cyclical universes that have always been around. So universes or multiverses, and that's also what Hawking believed in his M theory, that a multiverse has always been, and I think there's more evidence than there was some God who suddenly created a universe.
Well, let me address both of those points. First of all, Penrose's cosmology is not eternal in the past. He specifically says, when asked about that, I'm not addressing that question. He's simply asking if there's something before the Big Bang. He's not making a big claim that they go on forever. Nor is that Stephen Hawking's view. Hawking says almost everyone believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. But let me answer your objection against God, right? Because Christians believe God is supposed to be infinite, so doesn't that mean that God can't exist? In fact, in that article from which I quoted you, that was your conclusion as a young man, that since the actual infinite can't exist, God must not exist, right? Well, God's existence is simply a qualitative infinite. It's not as if God consists of an infinite number of parts. Now, if Christians believe God to be a physical being that we're, say, infinitely tall, then the objection against an actual infinite would apply to him. But clearly it doesn't in this case.
Well, since we're talking about infinite in my book, what I said is that the real number infinity doesn't exist, and some students of mine have made that mistake. And I did think in terms of that infinity, what about this kind of concept of a real God who's infinite? And you haven't commented about when you say you can't go on forever. Well, then how many years does heaven last then, if it's not infinitely long? And what about in the reverse direction? You can't say you go back an infinite amount of time in our universe, because our universe started with time. So I guess, according to your view, God existed before time. And what was he doing? And how long is before time? I mean, these are concepts that
Well,
are
St.
very
Augustine
difficult.
answered that question long ago. He was preparing hell for people who ask foolish questions.
And that's one of the problems, I think, that has happened with Christianity. They don't like doubters or skeptics. They want us to
That is just, that is
I'm the kind who
absurd.
does that.
That is absurd history, Dr. Silverman. I mean, well, let's not comment on that. Let me go to your basic question about a God's eternity. The classic Christian view of God's eternity is simply that God is timeless. So that God obviously has always existed. I mean, whoever God is, if there is a God, God has to be eternal. And of course, the Christian doctrine...
Outside of time.
You can conceive of it like that if you like, sure. But a timeless being. At any rate, a being that had no beginning. And the Christian view of life eternal is that life goes on forever. My point is that that doesn't ever become an actual infinite. If you have a definite starting point and you go on forever, you don't ever get to infinity. Just like my example, if you were to begin counting to infinity now and never stop, you'd never get there.
Well, first, I think maybe I should have taken my calculus course. We can have limits of infinity in a finite space, but when you talk about a God who was before time because he's timeless, and you're using not scientific arguments, just philosophical, it sounds to me like you're just making up the kind of God you would like to say exists, with its timeless and infinite, or maybe not infinite, I'm not sure. If you consider God if timeless is the same as infinite.
Well, all I'm saying is that the classical conception of what God's eternity involves has been that God is a timeless being, a being to whom past, present, and future are all one and the same. There are different models for that. And my point is just that that's in no way inconsistent with the objection against an actual infinite. It's not like Christianity has anything invested in making that up as they go along. But let me ask you this. If there were a God, you would think that that God has to have always existed, right?
No. I even mentioned, depending on your definition, a creator of life on this earth. And I'm expecting someday we will have humans creating some intelligent life that might think of us as a God. But we're still going to die.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. In Christian theology, one of the basic ways we think about God is according to the greatest conceivable being theology, after St. Anselm, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So let me ask you, what would be your conception of a greatest conceivable being? What is the greatest conceivable being that you could think of? And when you have that idea in your minds, do you love it? Do you wish that such a being actually existed?
Well, I don't conceive of a greatest being any more than a greatest number. And this is where we get to finite and infinite. Like, what is the greatest number? Call that n. Except n plus 1 is greater. And even if there's some kind of all-powerful being, I would want to know if that all-powerful being is a good or a bad person, because we've had all-powerful countries doing very bad things. Just because something is powerful doesn't make it necessarily good.
Well, of course, Dr. Silverman, I didn't say you could only give this being one attribute. You can give this being whatever attributes you want. I'm just asking what those characteristics would be. If you think about in your mind, I know it's hard for you atheists to do because you don't even usually think about what God would really be like, even if he did exist. And thus usually you're just talking to straw men when you come up with your arguments. But this is one way you can get around it. Just think about if the greatest being of which I could conceive did exist, what would that being look like? Take everything good and beautiful that you know of, ascribe it to this entity, and then tell me what it looks like.
Well, it's hard to say the perfect being. I don't have a conception, but I'm guessing my perfect being, if it's possible, would look different from your perfect being and many others. It's kind of like saying, well, what's the perfect pizza? People might disagree, and that has characteristics to it.
So you're not going to answer the question. Adam, I'll let you jump in here.
I want to say something that you'll hear very often from atheists. The phrase, I don't know. If we don't have an answer yet, we say we just don't know, and maybe we'll look for more evidence and eventually come up with an answer. But we don't make up stuff just because we don't know the answer.
I beg to differ. I think you atheists do that just as much as any backwoods fundamentalist, by and large.
Well, so all this talk about numbers and infinity and evidence and stuff like that. See, I wonder if that's a helpful or useful track. You know, my experience with religion, there's a lot of talk about sort of God being beyond understanding. There's an embrace of mystery, and which seems to me kind of intrinsic to the religious experience and something that religious people embrace typically, or should embrace, I guess. So I'm curious to know what you guys think. You were presenting a lot of evidence, but how come? I mean, I thought religion is faith. It's not sort of dependent on evidence. Like, what happens if you were to prove the existence of God? I mean, would that, then there wouldn't be any mystery left, which, isn't that sort of part and parcel of the religious experience?
No, simply proving that an entity exists doesn't mean that you have fully comprehended and exhausted that entity. I mean, just to give a perfectly mundane example, this happens in physics all the time. You may posit or demonstrate the existence of some field or particle, but it doesn't mean that you understand all the functions that that field or particle carries out in quantum mechanics or whatever. But as for the characterization of faith, again, I could not object more strongly. I don't know where you atheists keep getting this idea that faith is somehow this blind belief without evidence. I understand it. Again, if you're traipsing through, the backwoods country and stumble upon some country church and walk in, that's the kind of thing you're quite liable to find. But I would just say, step up to the plate and engage with some real Christian thinkers. Go to Barnes & Noble and pull C.S. Lewis off the shelf. You'll see immediately that Christianity, much less theism, is not without evidence at all.
You've left me speechless.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
You were talking about evidence. On the other hand, it seemed like you were kind of shying away from the essence of what's supposed to be, from my view, Christianity, and that is the resurrection, because that's, for most Christians, I think, the defining point as to whether or not Jesus is God, and that belief, whether you go to heaven or hell. So I'm asking why a loving God wouldn't provide more evidence for the resurrection.
Sure, that's a good question. First of all, let me just correct the misconception that one's belief in the resurrection determines whether or not they go to hell. According to Christianity, one's belief in anything doesn't get you into heaven. You remember what is written in the Epistle to James. Thou believest that there is one God? Thou doest well. That devils believe and tremble. So simply believing that a certain fact is true is not going to get you saved. Anybody who's read the Gospels knows that. I mean, Jesus is always threatening religious people who believe all the right things with ending up in the bottom of hell.
How about if you don't believe in the resurrection or in any gods? Where do you go?
Yes, well, it's not absolutely necessary to believe in the resurrection to go to heaven. I do think it's necessary to believe in God to go to heaven.
Well, why wouldn't there be any evidence? And I think you probably are in a minority of Christians in this audience who would say that if you don't believe Jesus is Lord and that he died for your sins, and without that belief, you will not get into heaven. And I could give you biblical quotes on that, even though they're contradictory quotes about how to get into heaven.
Let me insert myself here with a little fine point. There's been some evolution on this idea of salvation and who's eligible for salvation, actually. During the especially after World War II, the Catholic Church took the lead on this, but a few of the Protestant denominations followed suit. And in fact, some Christian doctrine now holds that you are eligible for salvation even if you don't believe, even if you actively reject God.
Well, let me speak to those things.
Through
First
Jesus
of all,
Christ, through the resurrection, and so on and so forth.
Okay, so thanks for saying that. So according to good Christian theology, I'm going to go out on a limb here and represent good Christian theology. Yes, all of salvation, wherever it occurs, takes place through Christ. Now, what is necessary in order to enter into the kingdom of God? Well, you have to be born again. You have to be remade to be the kind of person God made us to be. And what is that? A being that loves God with all the heart, soul, mind, and strength, and his or her neighbor as himself. So, but it's a common misconception that it's only in the 20th century that this happens. This is a common view in older theologians. You can find it in great reformers like Zwingli, Bullinger. You can find it in many even of the Puritan theologians.
Sure, the idea isn't that new, but the doctrine is relatively new. The formal doctrine.
Maybe for the Roman Catholic Church, but certainly not in the history of Protestantism. And if you read the early church fathers, people like Clement of Alexandria, for instance, or Justin Martyr, whom Dr. Silverman mentioned, those were all people who thought that those who have not heard the gospel can come into a participation of God's salvation. But as C.S. Lewis pointed out, the person who's usually asking this question today is not in the position of that person who hasn't heard. Right? He's the person who's asking, do I need to take Christianity seriously? Do I need to open that Bible and read it? Do I need to really seek God? And see, I think that there's plenty of evidence for the resurrection and for the existence of God, but I think the evidence is calculated in such a way to test our moral character, our love for the truth, and our love for good. You have to understand that God is not simply interested in us believing a certain fact about the universe, as if that could save us. But he's interested in trying and forming our character at its deepest level.
Well, let's talk about morality. You mentioned in your comments earlier that morality depended on, more or less, belief in God, that was the thing that informed what morality is, more or less. I'm paraphrasing you, I think, right? You're okay with that?
Sort of. Keep going. I'll let you finish.
Well, I'm done. I wanted her to have a chance to talk a little bit about morality without God.
Well, I actually prefer, as I said, different kinds of religions over another. I don't mind the kind of religion that says God wants me to love our fellow human beings, and because of that I will, and do unto others and all the good parts of the Bible. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people who put the love of God above the love of human beings, and they have biblical justification for it, which is why we've had so many religious wars, Christians fighting Christians about the true meaning of what Jesus wants, and I would just as soon look at the Bible, pick the good stuff, and you could find a lot of bad stuff that justifies treatment of burning women as witches, anti-Semitism, genocides, and if you want various biblical quotes that Christian leaders have followed to create such havoc, I'll be happy to give you. I have a couple of pages of them.
Yeah, I have a whole book full of the pages of atrocities that have been wrought in the world by secular atheistic regimes. And I am one of
May I point out a difference, however? I'll agree that there have been, Stalin was a horrible person and he was an atheist, but there weren't wars to promote atheism. You can have radical religious leaders who are religious or not, but you will have religious leaders who go to war to promote their religion and to kill the infidel.
Well, let me just say, let's weary the audience. This is a big topic, the historical, sociological, psychological fruits of Christianity versus atheism. And this is yet another topic that I'm looking for someone to debate me on. So if you know of any bold historian on this campus, I'm a trained historian, who would like to take me on this subject, I'd be more than happy to. I don't think there is any religion or philosophy on this planet that can even come close, even hold a candle to the good that Christianity has done for the human race. And I think if there's any religion or philosophy that should be utterly shamefaced when it comes to the historical record, it's atheism.
Well, would you like a quotation to support it? That's difficult for you to say. There's this interesting book that I read a while ago.
have a good time drinking today.
That's my writing. It's called The Evolution of God by Richard Wright. You know that one?
No, I do not.
It's cool. It's very interesting. I highly recommend it to everybody. It's a historical look, not a theological look, at religion and the way it's evolved over time. All religions, he talks about Islam and he talks about Judaism, and he talks about Christianity, the three big monotheistic faiths. And he points out that all three of those faiths evolved, absorbed traditions from previous belief systems, used those traditions when it was useful to do so, rejected those practices and traditions when it was no longer useful. They were either belligerent and went to war when there was something to fight for, which was rarely religion, by the way. It was usually political or social or economic. And religion was used as a kind of weapon in order to achieve economic aims. And it would become, these various religions would become more benevolent when things were kind of hunky-dory and very tolerant of other faiths. So, for example, in Islam, you have the early part where Muhammad needs to kind of get on. He's the underdog and he needs to get on pretty well with everybody. So, the Jews are people of the book, and you should be nice, and we're all good, and fine. And later on, when he's going to war, he becomes more aggressive and so on. And this happened repeatedly in all these different religions, historically. So I'm curious, having said all of that, I'm curious to know from you how you differentiate, if you differentiate, between the historical aspects of faith and that the value of understanding that versus the theological and philosophical aspects of faith, and how those two things can kind of relate to each other and form one another and serve your purposes.
Well, you have a lot there. I think I actually formulated an atheist argument against the existence of God, just taking these miscellaneous comments that I often get to people. I like to take people's arguments and put them in logical form so I can actually see what they're trying to say. And I think the argument runs like this. If there, let's just assume for the moment that God exists, right? So if God exists and has revealed himself, then we would expect the fruits of that revelation to be, on the whole, positive for the human race, or at least positive in the places where it's adopted. Now, I agree with that first premise, and the second premise that the atheist would use is that the fruits of that religion have not been positive or have been negative, and I think that's the line you would usually get from a lot of atheists today, with which, as I say, I would strongly disagree. So that just touches a little bit of what you're saying, but I think that's sort of the logic that I hear from a lot of people today, that either Christianity is bad, it's been bad for the human race, therefore it must not be true, or religion has been bad for the human race, and therefore religion probably isn't true.
And how to address that? Say something good about religion. What do you like?
Well, what I like about religion is the evolutionary process, that if you look at religion 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, during the Dark Ages, you would execute blasphemers within Christianity. They do in some religions today. I think they've learned, just like secular humanists do to some extent, what works well and what doesn't. Slavery was once justified by religions, and if you had a debate on the Bible about whether slavery is something that we should keep or abolish, you won't find anything about getting rid of slavery. But our culture has evolved, and fortunately religions have evolved with it. So I would say religion's a lot better now than it was in the Dark Ages.
And what about sort of the metaphysical aspects of religion? Do you find that there's value there in helping to understand the mysteries of the intangible things about our existence?
Well, I don't know if I would say understand so much as cope. There are a lot of people who are happier having religion than not, and if they need that in their lives, I know that my wife Sharon, who's in the audience, was a volunteer for hospice. People who were expecting to die within a couple months, and she would occasionally get some comment that, the one good thing is I'll be in heaven soon with my loved one. Sharon, who's an atheist, wouldn't say, no, you won't. These sorts of things.
Just like they wouldn't tell her on her deathbed, you're going to be in hell in a few minutes.
Well, that wouldn't bother her. She doesn't believe in hell. But, we try to be fellow human beings. And however, and I've heard people tell me that, I used to be a drug addict. I had no friends. I found Jesus. I gave up drugs, and I'm fine. And I say, if that's how you cope, we all need friends. I prefer to have human friends, but if that's the way it goes, okay.
Well, you know what St. Paul says, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die.
I think you're going to do that at the bar. Yeah. Oh, I did. Oh, okay. So, you guys want to chat a little more? Should we ask some questions and open the floor? Yeah. Or more questions? All right. I'm going to start with a couple of questions. Right.
There's going to be one mic is going to be brought down here, and then there's one already here. So if you have a question you'd like to pose to either of us or both of us, feel free to step up to the plate.
Form a line in the aisle. And you can form lines in both aisles. If for any reason we only have the one, I'll come over with my mic to the other aisle. Shh. Be quiet. Okay. I'm going to start by asking a couple of my own questions, and then we'll open the floor to you guys. Along the lines that we were just speaking about, Carl Sagan wrote, you quoted him earlier, right?
Yes, I did.
And what did he say? What you said he'd say?
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
He also said, a religion, old or new, that stresses the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science, might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. And in that vein, the late legal scholar and philosopher Ronald Dworkin has argued that there is a common non-religious denominator shared by believers and non-believers. Moral value, the basic underpinnings of what we deem good. He asserts that people of faith and atheists, therefore, might agree on certain fundamental truths that transcend any particular religion. Things like love and respect and understanding and helping others, as well as awe for the mysteries of our common experience. Do you agree, and this is a question to both of you, do you agree, and if so, are we, why are we having this debate instead of sitting together to work out the problems that plague humankind?
Well, yes, I agree, and yes, I would love to have us put aside as much as possible our theological differences and work to help humankind. Because in my view, what happens in an afterlife, if there is one, we'll find out or we won't. But we do know we all live in this life, and I think we should work together to make this life a better one for the less fortunate.
Well, I would just say that certainly believers and non-believers of all stripes can have common things that they think are for the common good, and they can agree on these things and work together. But I think that's a very superficial view of the question. I think what
Ronald Dworkin superficial.
No, I'm not calling him superficial. What he's pointing out is that, look, even unbelieving people, people who are atheists, have this sense of the sublime, this experience of beauty, for example, like I mentioned. Well, but you're stopping short if you don't see the tremendous existential question that is posed to the person who has that experience, namely, is this just illusory? Or is there a real transcendent good? Is there a real beauty? Similarly with morality, folks, sometimes I think you atheists have this little kind of bubble world that you live in, of shared moral values today, and you don't think broadly enough about human civilization as a whole, or historically. If I were to transport you today back into Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and you were to just start spouting off these things, they would give you a totally different picture of what they think the good is, and of what the good involves. And you would be powerless to argue against them. You wouldn't have anything that you could say other than, that's not the way we like it. And they would say, well, this is the way we like it. So these are not superficial questions, and I think the long view of history will bear that out. And I think if you teach generation after generation of people, there is no real beauty. Beauty and ugliness are subjective illusions. There are no objective moral values. There is no lawgiver. There is no life after death. It doesn't matter. Morality just boils down to preference. A certain civilization will surely be built out of that philosophy, and I can guarantee you it won't look like the post-Christian civilization we have today.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one more very quick question, and then we'll definitely turn it over to everybody else. And this is, again, for both of you, and answer quickly so that we can give others a chance. In a society that proclaims to value pluralism, free speech, and tolerance, do you think there are limits to what we should permit religious people to do? I am thinking about Fred Phelps, who just died, Westboro Baptist Church, or those who use God and the Bible to justify discrimination and prejudice, or worse, as Herb was alluding to, wars and genocide. Are there limits?
I don't see any limits on people believing what they want, as long as they're not harming others. We have secular laws to prevent that. I am for free speech, and I did not want to stop Fred Phelps from picketing or saying God hates fags. He was a horrible person in my mind, but he had the right to do that. I don't want to have people restrict other people from living lives to their fullest.
I'm a big believer in freedom.
Sir.
Oh, well, sorry, couple of ground rules. Questions only. Don't make statements, or I'll cut you off, or I'll throw one of my books at you.
But come to Juanita Greenberg's if you do want to make statements.
Right. So, questions only, and don't go on and on. Please.
Okay, I just had a little curiosity why neither one of you brought up Machiavelli. He thought Christianity was the reason the Roman Empire fell, as did Edward Gibbon. And we elect people if they have a Bible under their arm, but you can't be a good politician if you don't have a copy of the Prince under their arm. We've got somebody like Dick Cheney who is Machiavelli on steroids, but that's reality. What do you think about that?
Well, I guess I'm not quite sure what the question is. I mean, you're obviously saying some politicians are Machiavellian. They don't really care about religion. They just use religion to
How do you
get
build a
what
good
they want.
empire? How do you build a good republic? Chase ideals and you look bad like Machiavelli.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Are you going to deal in reality, or are you just going to chase after ideals?
Machiavelli.
Do you mean me personally?
Is there room for Machiavelli in your matrix?
Are you uncomfortable when you read Machiavelli? are you intellectually uncomfortable?
Well, I find reading Machiavelli intellectually stimulating, even though I utterly disagree with his political philosophy.
That's reality.
Who? You want to say something?
Just a brief comment that I think probably we can both agree that we should not be hypocritical, and most of our politicians today who do have the Bible as a way to get elected, whatever their beliefs, is not the right way to go. I am for separation of religion and government, and I hope you are too.
Probably not in the way you would be, but that's another debate.
That's another debate. Let's not go there. Yes, sir.
Yes, you were talking about the fact of the resurrection, and you were talking about the various things that prove that it is a fact. But one thing that I noticed that you didn't address what Silverman says is the differences, the discrepancies in the resurrection stories. But I want to go to another discrepancy within the New Testament, because to me the question is whether or not the resurrection stories are reliable. Are the sources of these of the Gospels themselves, are they reliable? And one thing that I would like to bring out to you is there is a discrepancy in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke about the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew traces genealogy, Jesus' genealogy through Joseph back through David's son Solomon. Luke traces Jesus' genealogy from Joseph back to David's son Nathan. Now, whenever I confront fundamentalists about this, who say about the inerrancy of the Bible, they always say that no, Luke's genealogy is being traced through Mary. Well, no, that's not how where it says it is. Joseph, who was the son of so-and-so. So my question is, how would you account for that discrepancy? And if that is a discrepancy, can we really believe these accounts they're giving are reliable?
That's a good, and there are a number of discrepancies, actually, throughout the Bible, right? So, how do you deal with that?
Well, let me just say that any historian who's worth his salt is going to tell you that the mere fact that there are discrepancies or errors or mistakes in a historical source doesn't render that source valueless. Now, you can pick at little things in the gospel record, but on the whole, the gospel record has been proven to be largely reliable. And I wouldn't want to comment on that whole genealogical question. I have to sit down and study it, and I bore you in the audience to tears trying to answer it here without anything in front of me. But I just want to make that main point to distinguish between, even if you think there are some errors in the New Testament, it by no means follows from that there's no science that historians have of trying to ascertain what did and didn't happen. I mean, this would be true if you're reading Herodotus or Thucydides.
I would agree that we should read the Bible like any other book, see what makes sense, what doesn't, what might be historical and what isn't. But most people, I think, read the Bible as the Word of God, and I'm wondering how you read it. If you take it literally, or if some passages you decide, well, that's just a metaphor. So, and there are contradictions even in crucial events, like what were Jesus' last words, who found this empty tomb, what people said. Those seem to be pretty important for Christians to...
How many magi there really were?
Yeah. Well, I'll be brief on this so we don't take too much time away from the audience. But I would just say that as a Christian, I read the Bible both ways. I read it devotionally as the Word of God, and I read it historically with a scholarly, from a scholarly point of view. My point about the argument for the resurrection of Jesus is that it is not based on any kind of a religious view of the Bible. As I said, the argument is structured in such a way that take the most skeptical approach you want to the New Testament. All we're saying is there are certain core facts which will emerge and which turn out to be surprisingly difficult to account for naturalistically. I'm just giving you a skeleton of how the argument works here. If you want to see the actual argument, come to one of our debates or our reasonable faith.
But it's safe to say that you interpret, I mean, you believe in the Big Bang. You don't believe the Earth is 6,000 years old.
Well, no, I don't, but the Big Bang wouldn't even be inconsistent with a younger.
No, no, I'm not suggesting it is. I'm only clarifying that you're an interpreter of the text.
Sure.
Colin?
Hey, Eric. Regarding an earlier conversation you had about believing what we want to believe versus believing because we believe in the evidence, Herbie, you said you wanted to believe because you pursue the evidence. Yet I've noticed in your presentation you were kind of behind on some of the evidence in terms of reiterating the warfare hypothesis, which has been discredited. You seem to have some lapsed cosmological research that you've been quoting, and also your analysis of the secular historical assessment of the alleged resurrection. You don't seem to have awareness of Bart Ehrman or Marcus Ford. Given that, how would you explain the gap between your claim for pursuing evidence and you arguing theories that some are as late as 30 years discredited?
Well, it's hard to say, which specifics you claim that my cosmological evidence is out of date. I think more and more people are looking at different versions of the multiverse where the universe could have lasted forever. We didn't talk about string theory or a quantum event, which was our universe, and quantum events need not have any causes. But you brought out Bart Ehrman, and Bart Ehrman has been in a discussion with other atheists about whether Jesus existed. He's a strong believer that there was a person, Jesus. He's also a strong believer that there was no evidence for a resurrection. So I'm not, and I would be willing to say that there was an apocalyptic preacher around that time named Jesus who was probably crucified. Most times, the people who were crucified, and just by Romans, that wasn't what Jews did, even though they were blamed, they're just buried in mass graves or burned. Jesus might have been in a tomb, and it might later have been empty, but there was part of the gospel say that Jesus would rise after 3 days. You would think in an event like that, Christian believers, they would be hanging around the tomb waiting for the big event, yet nobody was there, which again makes
Well, they were asleep.
It's hard to think, they'd always have a few guards for this big event.
They had guards. They were sleeping.
Without getting off on a long tangent, just two quick things. First of all, no cosmological model currently can be extended to past infinity. Remember what I quoted from Belenkin and even Lawrence Krauss. All the evidence says the universe had a beginning. Even that bicep 2 data that came out this week, remarkable discovery, just was the last nail in the coffin of the cyclic theory of the universe, according to which the universe has gone on from past eternity. And my only point about
was the last nail.
yeah, maybe there'll be a few more too. Totally great. Plenty of them so far. And my only point about Ehrman is, I quote Ehrman because he's someone that you atheists can't say, well, he's just saying that because he believes in the resurrection. Ehrman is an example of somebody who's a serious scholar. And lots of times when you atheists step up to the plate to debate the resurrection, it's like you've been trolling the internet for half an hour and picking stuff off of random websites or something. I mean, it is not anything that falls into the realm of serious academic research. And so I would just invite you to read somebody like Bart Ehrman. Just being a good scholar doesn't commit you to believing in the resurrection of Jesus
You're
Christ.
offending the atheists when you say you atheists.
Do not believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he's quoted Lawrence Krauss, who wrote the book A Universe from Nothing, and he gives good physical principles of why he thinks that the universe was a quantum event that did come from
But
nothing.
Herb, I'm not quoting Dr.
Let him ask questions. At the book. Infinity. This is going to go on for infinity.
So, I guess I would agree with you, Dr. Wallace, on nihilism being true, but I believe it to be true in the next world. So, I would like, my question is, can you expand on why nihilism is true in this world? And I would guess you wouldn't agree with me being it true in the next world, because you're going to have all your loved ones, you're going to be immortal, and you're going to eventually have infinite knowledge of the universe.
Well, I think you're picking up on that quotation from the atheist philosopher of science at Duke, Alex Rosenberg, who said, that was who I quoted from when I used the word nihilism. He says we need to face the fact that nihilism is true. And for Rosenberg, as for a number of other atheists, the fact that God doesn't exist means that there are no ultimate things like this. There are no ultimate moral values. There is no such thing as beauty or ugliness. There is nothing of which we can say that thing is really evil. All we can ultimately say is, I don't like that thing. So that's what I mean, that nihilism is true if atheism is true. Now, I don't think atheism is true, but I'm pointing those two things together to say that a theistic or a Christian view of the world makes much more sense of our moral experience than an atheistic view of the world does.
Can I poll the atheists in the room? How many of you are nihilists? Raise your hand. No one. I'm not sure they equate. Maybe they just don't understand that they're nihilists.
They're not both the way they understand.
And most of us, I think, do see evil in the world, like killing babies for no reason, which is justified in the Bible with various genocides.
Question.
Yeah, hi. So I'm curious, if your God is the one Almighty God, and He speaks to people and has been telling people for thousands of years about His gospel, how do you account then for the nearly 2,000 years of polytheism before that, where He apparently was not speaking to anybody? And then when it becomes Judaism, why did all of a sudden one day you just go, oh, well, I think I'm going to change the rules now, and you guys get to come to this heaven which I created, even though I didn't really tell you about it in the way that I am now. There's just a lot of illogical discrepancies there that I've never heard anybody account for.
Okay, well, fair enough. I think what I would want to say is just invite you to see the beauty of gradual and growing revelation. Sure, you shake your head like that, but think about it. You appreciate it in so many other areas of life. Think about how you normally think about the history of science. It's beautiful to you, right? It's gradual unfolding, it's growing and developing. Well, God's revelatory process is the same way. Again, I'm going to use this word, but I think so. I was going to say you atheists, but I won't. But I think so often you atheists are operating with a
then you condescend again.
small view of God, like a little Sunday school God that has to lay it all out, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right at the beginning, and never change or develop anything that He does. And I would just invite you to have grander thoughts of God from which will flow, I think.
That's back to my point of evidence versus mystery. I'm just wondering if you can even equate reason and religion.
Well, sure.
I come to some.
Well, I think both of those things go together. I think the evidence goes to show that there is such a being as God, a being that in the nature of the case is essentially and ultimately mysterious. By mysterious, I don't mean that there's nothing whatever to be known about Him, but what I mean is that being is inexhaustible. And as I said, that's one of the things that Christianity satisfies par excellence, our desire for a world that is both intelligible, what Einstein said was one of the great mysteries of the universe. Why is it intelligible? But intelligible without being exhaustible. You never get to the point where you say, we figured everything out, there's nothing more to discuss.
Incidentally, you'll never hear me say, you Christians, because Christians have such diverse views and fight over so many different issues, and understandably because of a Bible that contradicts itself so many times. So I'll just let Christians tell about that.
Herb, I have a question for you. Recognizing the first law of thermodynamics, matter energy can either be created or destroyed, my question is simply, how do you explain miracles? I have a friend, just one example, where she had severe blistering, eczema on her hands, bleeding, used it for years and years, went before a healing ministry and was instantly healed. Blood vessels, tissue, nerves, without the help of evolution. And my question is, and I've seen a number of miracles, so I'm fully convinced that it comes from a personal, loving Creator. And my question to you is, where do you believe this miracle power comes from?
Well, if I believe in a cured certain people, I would say with 50,000 starving children every day, why doesn't he cure some, look at the bigger picture instead of looking at specific miracles, which I would not call certain things miracles. It depends on whether you believe in miracles, but we know through various processes there are doctors who don't know why a patient was cured. Maybe years later they figure it out, or maybe occasionally these things happen. But a loving God who cures some people, kind of like if a plane crashes and two survivors, thank God for saving them without thinking about the 800 people who died. You know, that's not a loving God from my perspective.
Maybe they were the born again ones. Question.
My question is mostly for Dr. Marshall. You mentioned earlier that evolution kind of shows like a plan, and so that must exist a creator. Well, I mean, I'm just an atheist, so I guess I don't really know. But for most of geology, we look through the geologic record, and we've seen that 99.9% of all species that have ever existed are now extinct. So obviously those plans didn't work. They were fallible plans. I guess my question is why would an infallible creator create fallible plans to not work? And if, the reason that I get so often is that I am fallible and cannot understand infallibility, then how can we understand anything about infallible beings? Like how can there be any discussion on an omnipotent being when I, as something that can't perceive that, how can any human being perceive omnipotence and be able to talk about it?
First of all, that's a great question. A great question of even granted that it seems that God created the universe like this, and I showed how I think the scientific evidence is overwhelming in favor of God having created the world. It's not like that answers all the questions. One of the interesting questions is, well, why would he do it in this way? And I'm sorry that sometimes you ask that question and people have nothing to say except, well, we can't understand God. I mean, that's just part of the intellectual laziness of our culture, and that spans both sides of the aisles. I don't exempt Christians from that any more than unbelievers. I'm just appalled by the intellectual laziness of our culture. So as for why I think God has done it that way, I think one of the ways is to, first of all, to sort of dwarf us, to give us a sense, if you look at the whole outline of the cosmos, as well as sort of geological history, it gives us a sense of both our smallness and our greatness. Pascal had a lot to say about this and how important that is for our healthy psychological functioning for understanding who we are. And I think the other reason, though, is to highlight the value of what remains. It's sort of like when Robinson Crusoe has his shipwreck. The few little things that survive have special value because of all the other things that didn't make it.
Can you mention why you think this loving creator made different species that could only survive by killing and eating other species, when obviously he could have created a better world that even you believe in, and that's what we call heaven, which presumably, from your perspective, will solve all the world's problems. Everybody will be happy there. Why couldn't he just put us all there to begin with?
Sure. I had thought that you would at least, bring one argument up in favor of atheism, and I thought it would be the problem of evil. And I don't want to exhaust everybody with an answer to this, but I'll give you a brief answer to the question of why I think God didn't just make everything perfect to begin with. And it's because I think the glory and the joy of redemption exceeds the glory and joy of mere creation of goodness out of nothing. So to bring goodness out of nothing is wonderful, to be sure, but to bring goodness out of evil is a far deeper and sweeter beauty.
After our separation of church and state debate, well, we convene and debate evil.
Problem of evil,
That is a big topic for sure. Sir?
Well, I was going to say, tell that to children with cancer I see that die who have no chance of redemption. But I'll get to my question. The Bible claims of this God self-admittedly is jealous and angry, which aren't very becoming on people, nonetheless, the love of God. How do you, in the Bible, Herb's mentioned this tonight as well, but I mean, all you have to do is read anybody. it endorses slavery, objectification of women, killing firstborn. He killed the entire world except for one family. And I know you exhibited tonight how full of yourself you are, but where do you get the gall to speak on morality from the Bible?
Okay. Morality in the Bible. Let me address a couple of those points. First of all, with regard to my moral argument, it wasn't an argument that we need to get morality from the Bible. Though I think people who talk about the fact that there's slavery in the Bible and genocide and things like that are missing the forest for the trees. I mean, they're the overwhelming, seriously.
People who suffer and die, that's the forest of the trees for them.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. All right. What I was going to say to your broader point is that the picture of God that is in the Bible is not of just simply an all-loving God. I mean, anybody who's read the Bible knows that God is a God of judgment and wrath. And we tend today, we want a being who simply loves everyone and everything, right? And God is a being who loves the good supremely, and as such, the flip side of that is he also hates evil supremely. And so, as C.S. Lewis says, I think in his book, The Problem of Pain, when we merely say that we are bad, the wrath of God seems like a barbarous doctrine. But when we perceive our badness, it appears to be inevitable, the mere corollary of God's goodness. So I think the reason that we don't understand why there is this awful curse upon the world is because we haven't sufficiently reflected upon human evil. And my answer in brief to the problem of evil is simply that human moral evil exceeds natural evil. That is to say that we don't receive any more natural evil in this world than our moral evil warrants.
But the Bible is divine. So does God himself, because he's the asshole who killed everybody, he said you can enslave people, objectify women, and kill firstborn?
Come to Juanita Williamsburg. I promise I'll have it down. You're the candidate for phase 3.
I would add that God has evolved also, that the Old Testament reveals a more judgmental and wrathful God who's angry a lot of the time, but the New Testament God is different. He behaves differently. Well, anyway. Okay, so here's the deal. We have 10 more minutes, and then we're shutting this thing down pretty much. But I'd like to be able to get through everybody. So ask really fast questions, and you'll provide really quick answers. Yes?
Both of you have talked about war. Both of you have talked about wars of religion. Both of you have had myriad answers to this, but neither of you have really answered in depth about it. I would like to know, to Dr. Silverman, why he thinks that there have been more religious wars than not. And I would like to hear Marshall's response to this. But because there have been many tribal wars, there have been many clan wars, there have been many wars of political resistance, such as the current war on terror has been one of politics, and this was started by socio-political factors in the first place.
I didn't say all wars are of religious nature. Often, as Adam said, they're not, but religion is often a justification to get people to go to war, saying we're fighting for God to kill the infidels, even if they're just looking for extra territory. So religion is often misused for war.
Okay. That was quick. Thank you. Thank you. War. That'll be our fourth debate. We'll talk, evil and war. We can couple those.
There's one thing I would like to ask Dr. Silverman, and something I don't quite understand about naturalism and Darwinian evolution. Darwinism posits that we have come about, and that you have come about, and I've come about, through random forces, which would mean that our minds were created by random forces, which to me seems to be fatally destructive to the theory, which is that if our minds have come together through purely random forces, random mutation, natural selection, why do you put any confidence in anything you said tonight or anything that Dr. Wallace said tonight?
Well, as you point out, that there are random mutations, natural selection, that literally has taken place over billions of years And our species might be around because of an altruistic gene that, we help others, and that's why we're around. We do have minds that, as Wallace is often said, are bad or evil, but they're also good, and we do our best.
There's a biologist over there, Rob Dillon. Raise your hand, Rob. Go talk to him afterwards, over a beer maybe.
Quick answer, natural selection is not random.
I was just wondering, why did God make us think? Out of all creatures, let us choose between good and evil, have choices, and not just make us, like, He thinks for us? I don't know. Okay. Why didn't He make us perfect people? Like, we all had the same moral structure, we all thought exactly the same, we all believed in Him. Why did He give us the choice and option of thinking for ourselves?
Choice.
Well, because I think freedom is a good. Freedom is better than puppets. Short answer.
Will we have freedom in heaven when the people in heaven will all be believers, including me if I got there, because then I'd have the evidence?
Great question. Great question. We'd love to get into that.
Yes.
I'd like to ask the both of you, why do you feel the necessity or the need for having a debate such as this? Just because, I don't know.
That's a good question. Yes, you got something to prove? You got something to prove to me?
As Dr. Silverman mentioned at the outset, there's great value in coming and hearing what the other side has
It's
to
a
say.
great intellectual, experience, really interesting.
Well, your language seems to be deriding intellectual experiences as if they weren't valuable, okay? And most people today, one of the things I like to tell college students is, you can tell a good professor if he can give you the case for the other side. A good teacher is someone who can tell you what the other side has to say. A really good teacher can give you the most powerful case that there is for the other side. So debates are a wonderful way to expose yourself to the arguments of the other side and see what they have to say.
But this particular debate.
Oh, you mean why is the existence of God or the truth of Christianity important? Well, what do you think is important?
See, I'm in this debate. Okay, I'm in this debate, especially in the Bible Belt, in part to show that if you had stereotypes of atheists, I hope for some of you, whatever you think of the debate, that some of those stereotypes will be gone. At least you see I don't have horns.
So you're not out to make converts.
Well, what I'm out to do is have people think about things they hadn't thought about before. Maybe put a light bulb there, and they'll think it might deepen their faith, or it might change their faith. But thinking is a good thing.
Yes.
For Dr. Marshall, as a fellow lover of his history, I wonder why you kept your debate mostly to the West, when there's been far religious scientific advances throughout the entire world, throughout time periods, such as Muslims in Baghdad during the supposed Middle Ages. What do you have to say for the rest of the world in terms of that? Why idealize the West?
Well, there are certainly precursors to modern science in the Islamic world in the early Middle Ages, around the 12th century or so, and in the ancient world. But when historians talk about modern science, they're talking about something very definite, a certain approach to nature and a certain method for figuring out how nature works. And historians of science are agreed that that perspective on nature arises only in the 15th, 16th century, primarily in the 16th century, the scientific revolution, the 17th century, and many would stretch the roots of that back into the late Middle Ages. But it's a specific phenomenon that arises only in the modern West.
And the Enlightenment, which produced all that scientific.
Well, the Enlightenment comes afterward.
The Enlightenment minimized religion in getting out of the Dark Ages.
Another just bad history. Come on, Dr. Silverman.
Yes.
Hi, so I have a question going back to which is more reasonable, Christianity or atheism in the following discussion. You said multiple times, Dr. Marshall, that if human objective morality exists, then God must exist. So you have a premise that, again, if God exists, then morality can exist. If God does not exist, then human objective morality and duties cannot exist. Do you mind explaining why that is? And then, Dr. Silverman, do you mind, I guess, speaking back to his argument? I don't know if you believe in objective morality, but how can you believe in objective morality without believing in God? Where does that objective morality come from?
Well, as I said in my opening speech, I was just going to be broad in my arguments tonight. Normally I would take more time to open up the argument. But essentially it's an if-then argument, and I would take some time to define what I mean by objective moral values, namely just values that are binding and valid regardless of whether or not anyone believes them to be true. So if you think there's something that's genuinely evil, even if the whole world thinks it's okay, then you would believe in objective moral values. And my point is that that notion is fundamental to our moral experience, but impossible to ground on atheism. So that if you believe in that kind of morality, you ought to believe in God along with it.
My question, though, was why, because I understand your two premises, so I'd like to know how they connect.
Why do these an objective moral values?
Wait, what?
Everybody. Why believe in objective moral values, do you mean?
No. Why can't objective morality exist without God?
Oh. Well, you just have to think about how the world looks from an atheistic point of view. As I said, in that case, our moral values are simply the biological and sociological spin-off of our evolutionary history. It's a kind of a herd morality that has developed in order to help our species reproduce and survive. But, beyond that, it doesn't make it valid and binding just because, you've grown up with this herd morality or something. You don't have to do it. You want to comment on morality?
Frankly, I don't really care if there is an objective morality. I'm more interested in what is the most moral thing for our culture to do based on evidence and treating others kindly. Out there you'll see the secular humanists of Lowcountry principles and values on the table, and that's kind of broad ideas of how we treat our fellow human beings instead of concentrating on the theoretical idea, is there an objective morality? Even if we don't know what it is, I think we are learning how better to treat our fellow human beings, and that's where we should concentrate.
Yes.
The question is for Dr. Silverman. It seems that progressive morality kind of presupposes a standard. So my question is, on atheism, given atheism, what is the good? Not how do you know what is good. It's not a question of epistemology, but ontology. What is good given atheism? Thank you.
Well, given atheism, that just means without a belief in any gods.
Obvious.
So after that is more humanism. How do we treat our fellow human beings? And we found out good ways and bad ways in the past. So I see progressive morality as a good thing, and we should continue to progress.
Yes. Well, did you want to really quick?
20 seconds, right?
What is
All I'm saying, if you believe, the man's point was, if you talk about moral progress implies necessarily the existence of an objective ideal. Otherwise, all you have is change in moral opinions. Apart from that objective ideal, there's no way to know if you're progressing or regressing. So if you talk about progress, you have to be committed, upon pain of logical absurdity, to an objective moral ideal.
But why does that depend on God?
Over the beer.
Yes.
Hi there. I was just wondering about a comment that you had made earlier, how you don't necessarily need to believe in the resurrection to be saved. That kind of struck me. I personally was an atheist, am a Christian now, and I'm actually struggling with believing in the resurrection as we speak. And I just wanted to know, I know that you mentioned that people who have never heard of God, they have an excuse. But what about people who have grown up in
Yes, I don't mean to say that people who have been exposed to the gospel in an adequate manner and reject it can be saved. I was just responding with regard to people who have never heard the gospel. Can they be saved? And I think they can. Now, I still think they're saved through the atoning work of Christ, the redemptive work of Christ. I still think they have to be born again through their natural knowledge of God. But obviously, I think that they can be saved without believing in the resurrection. And to a certain extent, all Christians believe this, because we believe mentally retarded people, for example, can be saved. We believe infants who don't have any cognitive capacity to entertain the notion of the resurrection can be saved as well.
Wallace and I both agree that I'm not going to be saved.
You're not dead yet, Dr. Silverman.
Yes.
My question is for Dr. Silverman. Dr. Silverman, you make many appeals to evidence, and I'm not really interested in specifics of evidence, but more of how your criteria of evidence works, and how your selection and weighing of evidence is less prone to selection bias.
Well, I might be biased in ways that I don't know. I try actively to avoid it. I know as a mathematician, if I think I prove something, I also look for a counterexample to see if it's wrong. But in terms of evidence, if it's science, I like to use a scientific method. I look for counter to whatever I happen to believe. And in terms of moral evidence, I've learned how to better treat human beings from many mistakes I've made in the past.
Thank you.
Yes.
My question is for Dr. Marshall. Were you raised in a Christian home?
Yes.
So you believe Christianity is the one true religion. So were you just lucky that you were born somewhere where you were raised to be Christian instead of somewhere like India where you were raised to be Hindu?
I was blessed, yes. But go on, I know you don't know the point you want to make, so do make it.
I think that was it. It's such a random product of your geography, and that it just seems, how is it that you happen to be born into the one true faith, when the rest of the globe is ignorant? It just seems,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's really hard to.
Were you lucky or chosen? Excellent, but and the point I want to make is that, as with Dr. Silverman's other points in this regard, that sword cuts both ways. See, the idea is that, well, religion can't really be true. As Dr. Silverman said, the biggest determiner of religion is your cultural, geographical background. But any sociologist will tell you that's the biggest determiner of all of our beliefs. So it doesn't invalidate our beliefs to point that out. All it tells us is that we need to be careful. We need to be aware of these strong biases to believe the things that we were brought up in. And
How
that's
do you justify that one belief is right and all the other beliefs are wrong? I guess that's the part that I sincerely don't get, is how is Christianity, and I've tried forever to believe until I finally gave up and accepted it was okay that I don't. And I take a little bit of offense at the fact that atheists can't be just marvel in the natural world. I don't need something supernatural to see beauty in the world. The fact that the natural world blows my mind, but I don't need something supernatural.
my point is that you're looking at one sphere of human knowledge, which is religion. Even if you decide that no religions are true, it's not like you're not making a truth claim. No matter who you are or what you believe certain things are true, and a whole lot of other things are false. So the irreligious person isn't any different or any better person than the person who's religious. At the end of the day, everyone's looking at everything they can and saying, these things I believe to be true, and de facto then, the things that are inconsistent with those things are false, or less true at least. So that's not my point. It's not specific to religion. Many of the things that people bring against religion, they just bring it forward selectively without thinking about how that objection would bear on all the rest of our knowledge. Yes. Yes, sir.